Back. So real quickly, we're going to merge down all of this additional augmentation to drawing 1.5 so that it's all one nice layer. After which, we'll kind of get things into final pictorial position here. And we'll expand the canvas just a wee bit. Probably get closer to having the rule of thirds on her face or in some interesting area as far as the compositional grid goes. The rule of thirds being the intersection of the vertical and horizontal lines. It just makes for an easy place in terms of the eye placement. So we'll give her a little more room to breathe on that left side in case we want to add, or sorry, the right side of the canvas in case we want to add effects, and then the face is positioned approximately at the rule of thirds. So it's a good time to drop the opacity and start on drawing 2.5. I had some line art earlier, but it was based on the lesser version of the drawing. So now that we've amplified the previous layer, it's going to be a lot easier to configure an appealing drawing. And that's the process that you're about to witness. So going into this one, I was using, for drawing number 1.5, after we refined it, I was using a lot of larger scale brush strokes and sort of delineating the values, you know, creating separations with big shapes as well as with line. And that's sort of a hybridized way of drawing. It's a very kind of integrated way of parsing the visual creation, and it sort of lends itself to a more hybridized approach between drawing and painting. So that makes it easier to draw with shapes on drawing number 2.5. And I'm just going to try and stay zoomed out so that I can make sure that all my shapes are coming in an appealing way. And that will ensure that I keep the entire image in mind and not just some of the details I would be working on. I'll spend initially a lot of good time on the face, and I already sort of inferred a lighting source. That lighting source being one that's sort of spotlighting her. There's a secondary one from the lantern at her feet, but we're not too concerned with that. Right now, it's just about taking things to that level of finish. I'll probably speed this part up just because it's a lot of repetitive line work, but you're still going to see how that process kind of evolves from this perspective. So the reason you're seeing me deviate here a little bit from the arm pose is because as I stepped back, paused the recording, and took a look at this, I realized that, yeah, there's a couple things to kind of fix, tweak, and adjust, but one of the bigger changes that I can make in this version is having a more interesting arm pose even than the one that I chose initially. It's still a little bit stiff and not perfectly motivated for the character. And since the character is all we're going to be looking at, that takes a fair amount of consideration to create interest and intrigue. So I started to kind of use my own body and my own posing to think of different angles that I could sort of play with the hands and the placement of the forearms and arms, because that is basically what's going to add a lot of action and a lot of context to what it is that she's doing as she's sort of cruising by here. Because just balancing, that's sort of more of a that's more of a candid thing. For example, if she's just looking forward as opposed to at the viewer or at the camera, if you will, then it could be a little bit more about this pose. But if she's looking at the camera, then I would definitely have to change it, because then it feels less contextual. It has less of a story behind the eye positioning. So that's always something to consider if you're just doing a character vignette piece. So I'll try a couple different things with the arms and a couple different things with the eye positioning, and we'll see where that takes us. So you can see I've already altered the arm positioning and added some ideas regarding her dual wielding. Now it's a more dynamic image, as opposed to just sort of this stiff arm coming out this way, and this one had kind of a weak bend in it as well. Now we have much more motivated things for the hands and arms to be doing, and I want the face to reflect that. I want her expression to reflect that, charging into battle with her thin, probably magic-imbued short sword, as well as the fireballs, the fire spell that she's going to be bringing into the engagement. And I don't want her to look scared. I want her to look sort of, I guess, a little devious, or at the very least sort of braced. So I'm going to have to sharpen the expression of the eyebrows, angle those down more so. Game face, right? And I'm going to have her mouth be open, like she's either yelling an incantation or just delivering a one-liner before she enters the zone. Give her a little bit of sharp teeth action, probably. just because it makes her seem more fierce, and I want some sharp shapes in here. Again, we'll talk about principles and shapes before I let you go from this particular tutorial, so don't worry. We'll get into that. Just got a pretty upset kind of yar face. I think the nose and mouth can go up a little bit. This is where we get nice and picky. We've worked hard on it up until this point, and we want to ensure that things are going to continue progressing. Therefore, we are not afraid to move them around and alter them to what they need to be prior to calling this done. Probably going to go, yeah, with the downward look. Charging in, game face, not super happy about what she's seeing. Got some fierceness. I'm going to play with the upper lip expression a little bit. Add a little more femininity in for a lower lip. And zoom out to check my face proportions. I'm not too upset at those. They read even far away. As I rotate the canvas to kind of double check, I get a clearer idea. This arm still feels a little stiff to me. I'll probably alter that just because we're getting a bit of that hyperextension. So when I draw the final, I'll probably correct that more so. I like the crazed look on her face. It's pretty berserk. She's not very collected. I guess it would take some sort of upsetting dialogue or some strong tension to get a character to this point before they would actually go in sort of all guns blazing, ready to attack. I think in the sequence I would envision her throwing the fire first so she has one free hand and then sort of buffets the area before swooping in with the sword and kind of taking glancing blows. Because if you have that much of a mobility advantage, you're going to want to really play that. And she looks pretty cunning, even if she's kind of going crazy. Most of the shading I'm going to be doing is going to be drawing 1.5 with these lines, just to infer form. And you see me sort of designing these elements as I go. That's because I don't have the clearest idea right now regarding her aesthetic. She's going to have some frillier sleeves, but there's always room for kind of testing other elements. The big hat now, I'm trying not to make it seem too cliche or dorky, so that's going to take some additional designing, which is fine. It's just understanding that you're going to have to put the time in and being okay with that, just sort of acquiescing. And perhaps that is the best hat shape that I have right now. Again, it's pretty easily recognizable, so probably just stick with that plan unless something better comes along. Get some flowing fabric or cloth shapes coming off of it. Help add extra dynamism and detail. We always want to sell the angle she's going at with the cloth. Sort of that diagonal descent into attack phase. Alright. Everything else is looking pretty fair, so I'll continue pretty normally until I'm ready to tackle those hands. Just go down each and every one of these elements and configure the details therein, while adjusting the drawing just enough to correct errors or hyperextensions or little things like that. It's going to be a teeny bit more to the side here, just because that makes more sense with the positioning of the other leg. It's tempting to kind of draw the cloth first, this big cloth that's going to be going over her, over this other leg, but I'm still figuring that out anatomically and geometrically and position wise, so it's going to take a bit of redrawing to get that to read like there's weight being put on it and that the foreshortening and perspective are working. And it's also a lot of canvas flipping and zooming out. I do like the thigh-high boots idea. Good for more armor coverage and protection. And I can use some of the design to run the contours of the form and make it appear a lot more voluminous and appealing. And I already decided on those before getting to this point, so. I also just love thin lines as a little side here. I feel like they're just really elegant and fun to work with, but thick lines are good to design with too. Really any type of mark making, you just have to play to the same principles, which again I'll explain in the last chapter of this Improve Your Drawing course. And those types of things, when you're thinking along those vectors, you can really give yourself some nice results and room to roam and room to question and improve. So it's all just a matter of contrasts and foundations. Getting a little noodly here, meaning that I'm just detailing and not really thinking, because some of the areas are more difficult to work on, and your brain and mind will naturally sort of roam away for a little bit because they're afraid to fail. But you have to kind of just reposition your consciousness on the areas that you want to work on and force through a little bit and probably fail, but it's not the worst thing in the world. You gotta just risk making a big mistake to make something worthwhile, or even just to make something crappy. As I was watching an interview with Dan Harmon, who's the writer for things like Rick and Morty, and people procrastinate a lot in regards to their craft and working on it and certain elements of their projects. And he basically said that you just make something bad and critique it until it's good. And I think that's a really interesting way of approaching it. All right. So there's a little bit of sloping right here. I'm going to need to kind of warp out. The more rigid and balanced stance, which means the angle of the torso is going to be a bit different. And I'm going to have to move her and the arms up just a little bit. So grab this part, pop it a couple pixels upward, just for proportion's sake. Same with the arms. And while I'm at it, I'm going to try a different posture for that one, for the back one here. Since there's some extra room over here in this whole aspect of things, I figure I could work with that as far as the entire composition goes. I could crop it close and really work on mostly just her and the broom, but with this dynamism and this fuller kind of package going, I wanted to play with a few ideas as far as what spell she would be sort of dragging behind her. It would be interesting to really see if you were scrolling down your favorite social media feed or art gallery website, and what would stop you and catch your interest. And I'm just noodling as I say that, kind of stopping at the very edge of that gesture. And I'm like thinking of this almost like she's pulling a small moon behind her for depth. Like it's either a meteor or a space piece of stone of some variety, and she would be whipping it down at the ground and then coming in after the blast. Like it's her largest sort of spell. It could be a big, like, giant fireball, which would be equally cool. I feel like that would broom up, excuse me. I feel like that would destroy the back of the broomstick, potentially. If it's made out of bristles, in fact, but it could be a non-flammable material. It just gives us more depth and dimension. We can have a little bit of overlap. I've done a lot of like female spellcasters wielding various things, and it's just such a really cool concept to me. For one, it's just easy to draw girls as far as like interests go, but then you have this idea of dynamism and spellcraft and kind of all the games you grew up with as a kid. You really have to find your deep inner drivers when it comes to making things, because there were things that you experienced that made you want to make things, and you kind of have to lean into all that if you want to pull from those momentous memories. It's a pretty big sphere. It would be interesting for the lighting scenario. Like a big rock would almost be acceptable as well, even if it's not on fire. Fire does add dynamism and energy, though. So there's all these things to balance and consider. I'm just going to try drawing a sphere and sort of adding some craters or surface to it, which will be a fair amount of shading in the final drawing. Like, so you could have some chunks breaking off of it. Probably shrink it down a wee bit. Yeah, it doesn't have the same impact, so we're going to go with the big fireball. Probably dumb big, because it's got to be superlative. It's got to be exaggerated in some capacity. I'm not working in a really stylized way. I'm not working in a really realistic way. Therefore, I have to kind of play to my strengths as far as style goes. And if it's way above her and kind of closing in, but you know that she's controlling it because we have the arm, instead of being backwards in that way, it's more of a foreshortening thing. They kind of warp it back, redraw the perspective. And have the hand palmed open. I mean, it's either that or she's trying to stop it or tell people to leave. But I think that that's also going to depend on the direction of the composition. Like if she's facing to the left, then it feels like she's trying to stop it. But if it goes to the right, it feels like she's bringing it along. So we'll finish up with this then. This will be our last line art pass with these elements. I'm going to drop the opacity on them so that I can go back in with black, or this super dark gray, coolish color that I've been using. And then we'll call this process demo wrapped up. It got a little bit lengthy, but it's really about respecting the process for any given piece. To sort of recap as we finalize our elements here. First, you start off with a thumbnail to get your idea, your initial idea out. Then you keep critiquing that idea as you're developing it within like the timeline of how long you give yourself to complete it. For example, I didn't want this tutorial to become 2 hours, this portion of the tutorial. Therefore, I'm going to call it at the end of this last cycle here, and then you just refine toward that goal, toward that finish. Like, there was a piece that I did that was 20 hours, and I recorded all of that. It's probably the longest, most in-depth painting tutorial I've ever done, and that is available through 2D Art School. It's the main image for it, actually, at powerpainters.org. But I set myself 20 hours as a goal for that one, because I knew that that was going to get me into a certain headspace and a certain state. It's the state that you want to be in to create when you have just enough limits and pressure and tension and sort of a defined box, because too much freedom is just paralyzing. It doesn't make you look for solutions within the realms of what you've already set. And I think that that's a big mistake, because then you want to solve interesting problems and you want to create interesting imagery. So here's backing up a little bit. Arm is a touch short, and we're kind of breaking where the cloth is before that arm guard or band. So I zoom out to check stuff like that. What I can do is reposition this part and lengthen it. Make it make a little more sense design-wise. Wonder how many of those we need to sort of sell the form. All right. It's looking better. Rotate to check. Pretty solid. Still a little busted, and so I have to fix it. I mean, there's really no choice. Just fix it as soon as you see it, because otherwise you're going to just you'll leave it in there. You'll forget and you'll leave it in, and then you'll have work that suffers as a result. Alright, so that looks decent. Time to move on to the sword arm. It's a little too convex already. Depending on the material or the folding, you might just end up right about here. Get that elbow guard. This is kind of breaking my depth. Gonna have to shade a little bit to push it behind the torso. Right here, I might shift the positioning of the sword, depending on what looks best with the pose. Just playing with some drawing on the form to see if I can sell some more depth easily. You can see once you're sort of unsure, you have a tendency to wander. And you have to keep kind of bringing it back. Try and feel out the parts that are a little uncertain still. And even though I'm going to keep it right facing for the final, I'll still flip to check during the process. And maybe a sword's not even the best solution. It could be a staff, like a shorter staff. Got just enough arm position down. But if I can't figure out a good hand position based on this arm position, then I'll just get rid of it and try a whole new foreshortened element. And this is like kind of a fist pump. It's not really the best story, even though I can say it checks out drawing-wise. But it's not all about the drawing, it's about the thrill you're trying to bring to the person looking at it. And if I'm not thrilled, I don't feel like they'll be very excited either. So I'm willing to play around until I find something that gives me a spark. That's a little bit hype. The angles of that are kind of rad. I mean, it's like a really flawed drawing, but a really cool pose. Alright, so that foreshortening is going to be interesting to figure out, but it's way cooler, way more dynamic, and it's worth it, so we're going to go in for it. When I really don't know how I'm going to configure something, I usually start by doing it pretty zoomed out. Namely because I can see everything in its totality and relationship to what it is I'm making. And that really helps to understand whether or not it's working as a whole. And if it's working as a whole, then that part can kind of lean a little bit more on the parts around it, rather than just, if you zoom in, it's like you're working in isolate because that part really needs help, or it really needs refinement. I guess help makes it sound desperate, but like essentially you're flying the full image. You're driving the whole car, and then you realize, well, maybe the transmission needs some more fluid, or I don't know, car stuff. Sometimes I don't have an analogy for the things I want to talk about because my limited scope of experience. Essentially, as long as I can make it work at this level, I can always zoom in and refine the pieces. And the pieces I'm also simplifying, because I just am stacking shapes and trying to get them to overlap in ways that are appealing and don't look anatomically or proportionally distorted. And typically where there's the most chicken scratch or the most noodling, it's where the most uncertainty is. And so it's a process of like redrawing and refining and letting your hand just kind of do it a couple different times, and your eye will just be approving or disapproving based on those factors. So we're getting there, but it is going to take some refinement. Yeah, not too far. Alright, let's flip it upside down, zoom out, see if it still kind of works. Yeah, it looks pretty kamikaze. It's a little, I think it's the foremost part, the upper arm, that's not working as well. The forms aren't turning in that direction and doesn't help sell the illusion of wrapping away from us in space. Foreshortening does take some adjustment, especially if it's poses and postures you don't often work with. And if I really can't nail this from my head after several attempts, and my hand starts getting sore, I just go get reference. But sometimes you can wing it and you're all right based on just fundamental knowledge. Again, 2D art school people, but oftentimes you'll just have to go in and find the actual situation or create it via photo shoot and then come back to it. Yeah, I feel like we're almost there, but not quite. There's no shame in returning to it a little bit later if I do make the commitment to fix it. Still trying to make sure I stay true to what I would need to down in the torso region as well. It's a fairly complex image that's sort of brewing as far as pose and logistics go, so I'm not in any rush to complete it. And if I need to chop the tutorial down after spending more time on this, I will, because again, we're honoring the result, and in order to honor the result, you need to respect the process. I'll still make overall progress and come back to tweak what really needs it. I really think the barefoot aesthetic's going to work here. It just makes her seem a little bit more crazy because you got that kind of barbarian effect going on when people aren't really clad in armor or not too fully clothed. It's like she's just being, she likes to feel the broom on her feet. I don't know. I'm trying to spin ideas about this character as I work on it, because sometimes the drawing process can be sort of extended and a little bit arduous, and so you have to rely on story and other psychological motivators to keep yourself at a level of interest and to motivate the decisions on the picture plane. Because if you start losing interest, again, there's something wrong. If you're bored working on it, then people aren't going to like it. But sometimes the process is not the most fun, so you try to find ways to make the image or the idea more fun, and that makes the process by proxy more enjoyable. This is hardest to apply on client work, I promise. Just kidding. It's just a good way of parsing your pieces and process. And I don't apologize for all those P's. Alright. Not too bad. Still gonna need to pull this leg out a little bit overall, which means I'm going to flatten a couple layers. Is that good? Perfect. Yeah, I'm just going to create a new layer for that, transform it to be more over here with the original drawing. I'm going to bring the lower drawing with it because I like the amount of tone and shading I'm getting to my lines, because I've worked in layers and I want to maintain that. So get rid of this one because it's just going to distract visually from the silhouette I'm going for. Drawing 1.5 is almost like a silhouette drawing, and silhouette will tell you things that lines won't, and vice versa. You have to consult with all of your artistic fundamentals and tools. Working on the general proportions. When you change the head, you change the relationship to the body and all that. But she was looking like she could use a little more of a neck I'm gonna have to zoom in for this because it's a little more delicate work. Not sure about this. Don't think it's necessary. Those are definitely some evil girl eyebrows. She doesn't look like she's very nice. She's got a lot of eyeliner on. That's just some design stuff. Characters that want to be wild and wreck stuff and let go of inhibitions are often fun to watch because we wish we could do similar things on sort of a ideological level. Just like let out all of these like anarchistic or crazy or high energy urges. Again, I'm trying to elicit feelings in the audience based on what she's feeling, based on the ideas that she is conveying, with her pose, her posture, her expression. I'm just refining the ever-loving love out of the drawing. Still feel like it's really short. No, not that. Leg. Okay. There's something just unsatisfying about it, and I'm trying to articulate what it is at this point. When I'm at this level, I usually err on the side of getting rid of a lot of things. Even though the pose has sort of been established, I can still like hide this one, and if I get rid of this one and paste it on another layer, I have some room to play again. And this is more of a technical thing than it is part of the narrative or story. It's just about getting it to physically feel like she's really anchored or in a pose that really suits everything going on around her. And in order to do that, you have to be open to some other possibilities. This might require moving her around on the broom, but if I can get it to read with the rest of the image, then it's worth it. So she's just 2 layers with some detail layers that I kind of left up there. Yeah, we don't need those so much anymore, at least that one. And the detail layer, it just got moved a little bit. Just crank that back to the hat. Flip the canvas quick to check the new leg drawing. Yeah, it's a lot more balanced and epic feeling. I basically did the pose myself, the way she was doing it, and it didn't make much sense in my body. Like, you have to consult various types of intelligence, your eyes, your other senses, your kinesthetic senses, And as I tried that pose and I thought about the foreshortening, it just wasn't really selling it the way I would like. And so this feels, to me, much more balanced and like it has a greater consideration for the physics. Alright, so I'm just going to cut the broom out from drawing 1.5. Forgot a little bit. And then pop that on its own layer, lower the opacity again, reposition, and we need to scale that. I don't think we need this anymore, or this. I can more fully see my character who I can retone later. I think we can scale all this stuff. Yeah. Scale all this stuff back. That can stay. Alright. Grab these, kind of shrink it a little bit. Better scale between her and that huge magic attack. Turn the layer back on. Complete the silhouette. And then begin to finalize these elements. Let me check rule of thirds real quick. Pretty close. So I can move her down a teeny bit. And to the right. And then just expand the sphere to compensate. Having it go out of frame like that really makes it seem much more powerful and foreboding as a vignette illustration. I'm going to finish up her feet. And then we'll finalize this toning using a similar color to the broom. But I probably won't record that because this is about the drawing process. And I'm sure you guys are really looking forward to the principle, the different principles by this point, because I've overhyped them during this illustration. No, I'm kidding. We'll talk about them, it'll be good. Still want a tiny cape or skirt or something. Kind of overlapping the leg, just to give it that witch cell. And that should be enough for both legs, because I don't need what's underneath there so much. So I'm going to flatten, or rather merge these, and then merge these. Simplifying, we're getting down to the last bit. So we want this area to be nice and simple because it's complex enough up here. There's enough complexity. We don't need all of this fighting for our attention as well. Alright, that's enough stretch for the cloth. I'm going to have to bump up the contours a little bit to show the overlap of form. I just got to figure out the positioning of the feet. And we're in a pretty good position. I wonder if I want the pants. I like the trajectory of the limbs, but I think I'm gonna do a light erase of the pants and instead go with just leg anatomy. Except I should keep the pants because I already figured out the drawing element of it. So I'm going to have to create another layer and knock those back, so as not to try and redraw anatomy without having some sort of fall on. Having some sort of fall on. Alright, so the knee, upper leg, have it be maybe bandaged like I had an initial idea for. Those are really nice to help self-form. Should be zooming in for this. I'm doing a lot of studies trying to nail feet down better. But I've done a lot of drawing them in isolate and not really a lot of anatomical connectivity like the full leg. I've drawn full legs enough that I should be able to just sort of pull it in. The last 10% is always the most challenging. There we go. Kneecap, calf, curve of the calf muscles, connect it in. It's because I'm also balancing the act of putting her feet on this broomstick. And I can always figure out her pose as I get this thing to work. Alright, almost there. And some of those bandages. Figure out what's overlap and what's not. Don't need that. drop this down, merge, and I'm going to get rid of some of the uncertainty. As this leg gets pushed to the fore. Alright, head's a teeny bit big. The hat also gives it way more presence. Let's see that, double check. Cool. Not bad. We got motion, we got direction, we have a fair degree of anatomical accuracy, all things considered. And that is, pretty close to knocking out the full drawing phase before actually going into, say, a final painting. I would feel comfortable taking this to poster level, like a nice vignette poster, just because I've now had so many different areas and elements that I've taken into consideration in the drawing phase. And even then, there's still a fair bit to be worked on, but the general theme that never quite goes away is that you just keep refining the elements until the whole picture starts to really reveal itself. And I have similar flowing elements around the other parts of the picture plane. But yeah, you'll see that it'll eventually start to kind of work itself out the more you aim to better the different parts of the image. And that's always a really exciting feeling. And getting it as close as possible before, like, let's say jumping into a painting phase is pretty advisable. But this is about how to improve your drawing and your process, and that's basically just the refinement of several areas and ideas until they became more presentable. I'm going to have some flat tones on this character, and she's going to be the main cover for this, so it's really fun getting to share the process and getting to configure these things in a mostly real-time way so you can see the decision making and the principles behind it and some of the theory that we're going to go into in the next lesson. But yeah, you could keep on tweaking the minutia and going in to all these little areas and parts, but I think that for the purposes of having a foundational modality you can trust, we've pretty much got one as far as thumbnails, refinements, lay in the elements. Don't be afraid to get rid of parts and retry if it's going to serve the entirety in a more enjoyable capacity. So that wraps it up for part 3 of the process, kind of bringing it home, bringing the line art home. The rest of this is just repetition at this point. So let's talk principles and theory in the next and final lesson of Improve Your Drawing, and we'll get into some of the contrasts, polarities, and ways of mental modeling that help you with your process and your general creative considerations. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter, and happy creating. Remember when I said it was final? I was kidding a little bit, because we still need to fix this one glaring thing, and that is to have the piece of cloth again wrap around the form of the leg. The leg is cylindrical, and therefore it has to be contoured. It has to be notably visually separate. So I've just gone in and done that quickly. You can kind of finish off this shape somehow. Every shape kind of has to have a termination point. So I can just maybe use that as like a garter. And just push the detail up and back. And of course we can kind of add a couple different marks to infer some shading. That this object is in fact behind other objects. Just a simple shadow separation. It's a very hypnotic process. And a little bit right there too, just for good measure. There we are. Get a little bit of a turn of form right there too. Thicken the leg a little bit at the back. And now we're fairly solid. There's still always stuff to tweak, always stuff to fix, but at least you have an idea of what it's like bounding back and forth in certain elements of the process and structure. And this was all done sans reference. If we wanted to take the next step and make it incredibly believable, we would just keep adding reference, just keep fixing up certain elements, all of that good stuff to ensure that we just continue to make it better. It's an ongoing process as you're striving to improve the work, but again, always worth it. So yeah, I'll see you in chapter 5 where we'll talk principles and wrap it up. Happy creating.